Throughout history, there have been some pretty intense moments that we all know about. But what about the ones that flew under the radar? Here are 5 moments in history that you won't learn anywhere else. James Earl Ray was arrested for the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. On April 4, 1968, James Earl Ray was arrested for the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. As many of you probably already know, Dr. King was an American clergyman who became the most prominent leader of the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1968. He led many peaceful protests against racial segregation in the southern United States. However, during this time, many people were still racist and would do anything to keep black and white people separated. This included violence. So, despite the nonviolent efforts from Dr. King and his followers, they still faced a lot of opposition. Unfortunately, it got much worse when on April 4, 1968, Dr. King was shot in Memphis, Tennessee, while standing on the balcony of a motel room. Although he was rushed to the hospital, he was pronounced dead shortly after arriving. People all over the country mourned the loss of such a powerful man. And within days, riots broke out in several cities. This is when James Earl Ray came into the picture. Less than 2 weeks after Dr. King's death, the police announced they had arrested Ray in connection with the crime. He initially pleaded not guilty, but later changed his plea to guilty and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Although he was released on parole in 1998, he died in prison just 3 years later. In April of 1966, an F5 tornado devastated Topeka, Kansas. If you live in the United States, then you're probably aware of how dangerous tornadoes can be. But fortunately, they're not something we have to deal with too often. In fact, according to the National Weather Service, only 15% of the population lives in areas that are considered to be at risk for tornadoes. However, back in 1966, things were very different because on May, a large tornado tore through Topeka, Kansas. According to the National Weather Service, the tornado touched down around 4:25 p.m. and remained on the ground for nearly 20 minutes. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal because no one had ever been hurt or killed by a tornado in Topeka before. Plus, the tornado only lasted for about 20 minutes. However, the damage it left behind told a different story. In total, there were 47 injuries and 4 fatalities. Additionally, approximately 5,000 homes and businesses were destroyed. And if you think that doesn't sound like a lot, consider the fact that Topeka only had a population of 117,000 at the time. In 65 AD, the Jews revolted against Rome and captured the Fortress of Antonia. If you know anything about Jewish history, then you've probably heard of Hanukkah. But do you know why they celebrate it? Well, it has to do with the rededication of the Second Temple in Jerusalem after the Maccabees revolted against the Seleucids. However, this wasn't the end of their troubles because not long after, the Roman Empire began oppressing the Jews. This eventually led to the First Jewish-Roman War, which lasted from 66 to 73 AD. During this war, the Jews fought against the Roman army and even managed to capture Jerusalem. But unfortunately, they lost the war and were forced to flee. Nevertheless, there was one group of Jews who refused to give up. They retreated to the Fortress of Antonia and continued fighting. The fortress was located on the western side of the Temple Mount, and it was strongly fortified, making it extremely difficult for the Romans to capture. But after 4 years of battling, the Romans finally prevailed. However, it wasn't easy because the Jews fought bravely until the very end. In 1783, the Laki volcano erupted, causing famine across Asia and Europe. Located in Iceland, the Laki volcano is one of the largest in the country. However, although it hasn't been active since the 19th century, it has a history of causing massive eruptions. For example, back in 1783, the volcano erupted, sending over 1.2 cubic kilometers of ash and lava into the air. It not only covered the entire island of Iceland, but parts of Europe and Asia as well. But the damage went far beyond physical property because the volcanic ash disrupted weather patterns all over the world. This meant that crops failed and livestock perished, which caused food shortages in many countries. Some places were able to recover after a year or so, but others struggled for many years. And if you think this is why you shouldn't live near a volcano, just wait until you hear about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. On September 7th, 1301, the Italian Renaissance took shape when Michelangelo's David was installed in Florence. Angelo was born on March 6, 1475 in Caprese, Italy, but his family moved to Florence when he was very young. From an early age he showed signs of being very artistic and would draw pictures of peasants and farm animals. His father wasn't a big fan of this, though, because he wanted his son to become a lawyer. Because of this, Michelangelo was sent to live with his father-in-law, who owned a quarry. There he spent most of his time working with marble and stone. Then, when he turned 13, he was sent to the home of a famous painter where he learned the basics of painting. After spending 6 years under the painter's mentorship, Michelangelo decided to try his hand at sculpture. However, he wasn't allowed to create any sculptures until he turned 21. This was due to a law that prohibited anyone under the age of 21 from sculpting biblical characters. Fortunately, he found a loophole when he created an angel for the pulpit of a church. After this, he rose to fame and became known throughout Italy. But this wasn't enough for him because he wanted to take his art to the next level. So he moved to Florence and started planning his most ambitious project yet, a statue of David. However, he wasn't the first one to attempt this because 2 other artists had already tried and failed. But this didn't discourage him, and on September 7, 1501, work began. It took Michelangelo over 3 years to complete the statue, but when it was finally unveiled on September 16, 1504, everyone was amazed. Many believe it to be his greatest masterpiece and the epitome of the Italian Renaissance. Though these are some moments in history that you may not have learned elsewhere, there are so many more that deserve to be talked about. Well, if you want to find out, now would be a good time to subscribe so that you do not miss our videos. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.